Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the fourth talk in the Women in Climate Change speaking series. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Dr. Katie Glover, and I am here as a research associate at the Climate Change Institute here at University of Maine. And I'm also an instructor for School of Biology and Ecology and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program here on campus. So before we get started, I'd like to mention first, this event is sponsored by the McGillicuddy Humanities Center as part of a year-long symposium on the story of climate change. And we have one more talk in this particular series coming up that is on April 8th, also at 2 p.m. And we'll be hearing from two high school speakers and students who are involved in Climate to Thrive, a local advocacy group, and working to expand solar panel power to high schools around Maine. I'll also mention that as part of WGS, we have an event tonight, the Marianne Hartman Awards, which honors University of Maine women alums for their work and accomplishments in the arts, business, politics, education, and community service. And that's from 5 to 6 p.m. tonight. I've attached a link to that event if you're interested in the chat. And then if folks are here, you are registered for the last talk in the series too. You can use the same link, but just in case, a link directly to that event, I've posted in the chat as well. So before introducing our speaker today, I'd like to first acknowledge the land that we are on here at UMaine and read our land acknowledgement. So the University of Maine recognizes that it is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac, through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and the other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. So with that, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker today. This is Dr. Kelsey Emard, she, her pronouns. And I'll go ahead and read her bio. She is a environment geographer and member of the Instructional Faculty in Geography at Oregon State University. Her current research examines shifting agricultural land uses and livelihoods driven by amenity development in rural areas, plant health and disease, and climate change. She is interested in creative feminist methods involving podcasting to analyze and understand often overlooked visceral data. So with that, welcome, Dr. Emard. We're glad you're here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for welcoming me. It's really wonderful and a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm looking forward to chatting with you at the end of this and discussing podcasting in more detail, which is such a fun and interesting topic to think about and explore. I also want to start by thanking the McGillicuddy Humanities Center and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at University of Maine for, with Katie, organizing this and hosting it and making this seminar series possible, and that I could be a part of it. So I'll start with that, and I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, everyone can see that? Good? Okay, fantastic. So let's get started. Oops. Okay, so thank you, Katie already started with the land acknowledgement for Maine, but I would also like to give an acknowledgement of the indigenous land from which I am speaking from today. I live and work on the traditional homelands of the Marys River of the Kalapuya people, Marys River Band of the Kalapuya people, who were forcibly removed in the 1800s from this area to the Grand Ronde and Siletz reservations. Today, descendants of the Kalapuya people are members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and Siletz Indians. They are also members of our community. They make incredible contributions to both to Oregon State University and to the land which we now refer to as Oregon. So I start with this acknowledgement out of respect for their place on this land, their long history and knowledge of the land, but also the water and the ecosystems, as well as with the goal of moving towards restoring their connection to land and water here in Corvallis, Oregon, which is where Oregon State University is located. All right, so today I want to talk about how podcasts can be used as a research method. So we already know that podcasts are very effective as a medium for communicating information and knowledge. But what I'm interested in is thinking about how not only they're a medium for communication, but also as a method for generating knowledge in a different way with perhaps different results. So that's what I'm going to explore. Before I get into that, though, I want to talk about how I came to thinking about podcasts. Particularly from my work as a feminist geographer and situating my work within feminist methodologies, drawing on feminist methodologies. From there, I want to move into sharing with you about a collaborative project that I was part of with two colleagues a couple of years ago, where we generated a podcast to sort of explore this question of how podcasts can work as a method for generating knowledge. And so I'll share some of the findings from that project, as well as some of the limitations and critiques of podcasting. And then finally, I want to get back to the whole topic of this seminar, which is really about women and climate change. And so thinking about how podcasts can be used, and in fact already are being used, to help us understand women's experiences of and responses to climate change. Okay, so I situate my scholarship within feminist geography, which is an approach that aims to apply the critiques and perspectives of feminist theory to the study of humans and environments across space. So in relation to climate change, which is one of a topic that a lot of geographers and that I also look at, particularly interested in how questions of power and social difference intersect and shape climate change. So from my perspective, I would apply, when I think about climate change, I would want to think about how climate change impacts people's experiences differently across particularly gender, but also other forms of social difference like sex, race, nationality, ability, and a myriad other forms of social difference. And then similarly, to go along with that, I'm very interested in how gender power dynamics, but also other social power dynamics shape one's ability to respond to the environmental challenges that are associated with climate change. So feminist approaches don't necessarily have to engage gender always, but they're definitely concerned with issues of social difference and social dynamics. So for many feminist scholars, these kinds of issues of difference are often eluded or obscured in research where we think about the impacts on a people group as a whole. And so we prioritize feminist methodologies to help us get to these questions of difference. So there's a number of approaches, and for many of you, this may already be extremely familiar to you, but it really shaped how I approached the idea of podcasting. So I want to share it here. For me, there's three aspects of feminist methodologies that are really core. The first is positionality. So from a feminist perspective, all researchers, the researcher always has a role in the research, right? In shaping that research. So how our social identities, how we were raised, the experiences that we've encountered through our lives, our geographic location, these things shape how we conduct our research and how we interpret the results and how we understand what we've encountered. And so for feminist scholars, there's a real focus on putting ourselves into the research story because there is no way for us to actually be outside of it. And so there's a focus on recognizing our positionality and going ahead and inserting that into the story. And so for this, I find much potential in podcasts, as I will talk about in a moment. Let's see here. The second is the social power dynamics that are in the research context. Now, this is really, in some ways, can be really closely connected to positionality, thinking about the power dynamics between the researcher and the researched. And for many feminist scholars, there's an interest in transferring the power of the authoring to the research participants through collaborative interpretation of the data, through collaborative writing, right? But it also can refer more broadly, not just to the relationships between the researcher and the research, but also to the context of whose stories are being told, whose stories are being silenced, who's being interviewed. And so another key goal for feminist scholarship is to basically highlight those stories that have been silenced. And so I think when we think about climate change and women, there's a lot of silenced stories that perhaps can be brought to the fore. And then that leads us to the third component of what I think is a key to feminist methodologies, which is seeing certain categories of data that have been obscured in the past as really important sources of knowledge. And these are aspects that were traditionally considered to be often the woman's domain. So things like emotions, the household, the body, the act of caring. These are seen, these sort of embodied and emotional sources of knowledge are seen as really important sources of data that have been oftentimes attended to less in research. So a real focus on accessing those. And so you can apply this approach to any type of research, GIS mapping and remote sensing analysis, quantitative surveys, but you can, and of course, qualitative interviews. You can apply these principles in all contexts, but a lot of times feminist scholars have been interested in what we can do with creative methods to achieve these goals. So things like art and performance and autoethnography. And that's what led me to thinking about podcasts. So the questions that are undergirding this talk and also my broader interest in podcasting are, one, let's see here it is. Beyond a medium for communicating knowledge, can podcasts also serve as a method for producing knowledge, in this case about women's experiences of and responses to climate change? And two, if that is so, then how might this method allow us to generate knowledge in a different way and with different results? So that's the question that I would like to explore with you today. It's already very clear that as a medium, podcasts are very powerful for disseminating knowledge. You can see on this screen here a whole bunch of popular podcasts, and you may be familiar with some of them, but of course it's just a tiny fraction, and the number of podcasts that are published and available have grown tremendously in the past 3 years. In 2018, there were approximately 550,000 different podcasts with 18 million episodes, which is already quite impressive. But as of this month, the most recent research is there's almost 2 million with over 47 million episodes. So pretty significant in terms of the impact that this medium of communication can have. In the US, the number of people listening to podcasts regularly grew 54% in the past 3 years, and it's estimated that about half of the US population between the ages of 20 and 40 are listening to podcasts regularly. So it's certainly an important method of communication. But the question for us is, beyond communicating research findings, can podcasting also serve as an important method for generating research findings? And so my exploration of this question began in 2016. And at the time I was a graduate student at Penn State University. And I was working with two colleagues, Nari Senanayake and Eden Kincaid, who aren't able to be here with me, but I would like to acknowledge and thank them for all of their work with me. And we've published an article that I have here that kind of documents our findings. But during that time, we worked to develop a 3-episode podcast, which was looking at the sociospatial elements of a union organization effort by graduate students at Penn State at the time. So thinking about how the university space was framed and organizing efforts were undertaken in that context. And through the project, we were really concerned with understanding if and how using podcasts changed the way we did the research, and through changing it, if it, generated different data and intervened in contemporary debates in new ways. And our study suggested that yes, there is the possibility for podcasts to do that. So that's what I would like to spend a little time discussing right now. And this slide is the core of our findings right here. So there were 3 primary ways that we found that the act of producing a podcast, the act of interviewing for the purposes of a podcast, the acts of editing audio data versus reading transcripts and deciding what to include, changed the way that we conducted research. And these were the 3 primary, and it held a lot of promise, particularly for feminist methodologies. So here were the 3 things that really stood out to us. The first was that as an auditory medium versus a textual, a reading, a visual, we found that the podcast could capture embodied data that a text could not. So in a journal format, when you read a transcript and write some interviews and put them into a journal format, the content of what is said is seen as the most important data, right? It's the words that are relayed that are seen to have the most meaning, to be the important aspect of generating meaning. Occasionally in journal articles or in written text, a researcher will try to describe the emotions or the body language of the interviewee, but oftentimes those aspects are lost, right? When we or at least they become of lesser importance when we're writing. And the words themselves are meant to carry all the weight. But with a podcast, what is said is not the only way that data can generate meaning. Instead, the visceral elements of the speaker's voice, such as intonation and emotion, carry meaning that is often overlooked in text-based forms of knowledge production and communication. So amongst geographers, there's a move towards trying to use some auditory methods like sound diaries and soundscapes to try to bridge that gap between text and meaning to help understand how people move through and understand space, how they might feel excluded from space, trying to get at some of that auditory data that is oftentimes mentioned. And podcasts similarly allow us to think about and reflect more on that auditory data that might not be considered so much if we're reading through a transcript and trying to analyze the data. So in the podcast that my colleagues, Nari and Eden and I produced, there were many embodied expressions of passion, of anger, of urgency, and of fear. And these were very palpable in the voices of our research participants in the podcast. In addition, we felt that the distinctness of the participants' voices, their particular accents, their tones and tempos, they reminded us when we were editing the audio, but also our listeners, that the voices belonged to real people, not mere data points or disembodied respondents. And so listening to the visceral quality and the way that it connected and moved us emotionally caused us to wonder about the possibilities of learning that might emerge when the public listens to research through podcasts instead of reading about it. So for example, we wondered if it was possible that by hearing the voice of a research participant, listeners might be reminded of the participant's personhood and positionality in a way that differs from written text. We wondered if these podcasts might be able to humanize the terms of debate and portray complex and conflicted lived experiences without caricaturing our research participants' identities. And we wondered if the auditory connection between the listener and the speaker might create more empathy or interest in the listener in a way that maybe wouldn't occur on text. So these were some of the questions we were left with, but we definitely felt that the visceral data produced through a podcast held potential for feminist methodologies, particularly in the way that it was able to engage emotion and affect as a key source of data. Okay, so that was the first. The second thing that we were really struck by with podcasting was the ability for the podcast to create opportunities for dialogue. So the research process was more dialogical and more polyvocal. And I've included a quote here by the social geographer Saraswati Raju, who defines polyvocality as multiple voices representing multiple viewpoints and discourses coexisting without privileging one voice over the other. So if you think about, there's also a really important article that I've also quoted in here from Dialogues in Human Geography by Rose Redwood and colleagues in 2018 that really talks about the fact that most of our research it's not really dialogical. It's one person speaking and then waiting and another person speaking, kind of taking turns, and not a lot of really quick and immediate back and forth, both between our articles. There tends to be a lot of time elapsed before we respond to one another, but also in methods like interviewing and surveying. Generally, we listen, we absorb, and then we go by ourselves and we analyze and interpret and write separate. And so these elements of this dialogue are kind of pulled apart through most of our research processes. In contrast, a podcast format requires more direct dialogue during its production. So to kind of think about this more, we turned to another geographer, Manel Montani, who has created a radio show called Sense of Place that that basically kind of explores these elements of geography in this sort of live environment. And Manel Montani found that she had to listen to her interlocutors much more closely when she spoke with them for a radio segment than when she was preparing academic articles or lectures. On the radio, she felt compelled to engage her guests, even when they disagreed with her, right? She couldn't just sort of push it to the side. And then to return back to this article by Rose Redwood et al., sorry. A dialogue in the context of radio or podcast presupposes the capacity to listen to and engage with one's interlocutors rather than treating them as an enemy. So there's a process of collaborative effort of coming to consensus that occurs, and we found this in our podcast. There was a point in our podcast where the three of us as hosts disagreed with each other, and we chose to leave that element in the podcast, in the end result, because we felt that it showed multiple perspectives and allowed the listener to make kind of their own conclusions about that. So dialoguing in the podcast format makes two elements of feminist methodology more achievable. First, it requires the researcher to put themselves into the story. So we're getting back to that idea of positionality, that the researcher is interpreting what they're hearing. And so the podcast format requires that positionality is made clear, and that their story is kind of inserted alongside and becomes part of the research. How do they relate to and interpret the participants' words? So that's one aspect of feminist research methodology that really comes through in the podcast. The second is that by necessitating the acts of listening, challenging, and creating consensus, more than one voice is heard and disagreements can become part of what is presented. Okay, great. So rather than forcing consensus and rendering disagreement invisible as a more monological mode of presentation might do, the dialogic potential of the podcast allowed polyvocality to become part of the presentation of data. All right. So the third potential of the podcast is really in its ability to serve communities beyond or just wider, both academic and non-academic communities. Because it frequently does take a collaborative form with research participants, it kind of disrupts that power relationship and allows the research participant to have more authority in the authoring of the knowledge, and they can respond back with, no, you're not interpreting that how I intended for you to interpret it, for example. So there's more collaboration, which can make the research potentially more relevant and useful beyond academia. Podcasts are also generally created using more informal and everyday language than academic articles. And so this can be really important in terms of making the podcast or making the research more applicable in a broader sense. What I'm going to get to in a moment when I talk about critiques and limitations, but also here can have positive potential. There's the ability to include diverse voices, different vernacular, different speech habits, different accents, and these can allow more stories to be told. Particularly, people from diverse backgrounds can begin to see themselves in the research in a way that perhaps doesn't happen always in the written text. And so that form of connection is really important as well. Finally, podcasts can be circulated and shared via various platforms, many of which are free, like smartphone apps and social media. And so it can broaden the terms of impact of the podcast. So now I'd like to talk about a few of the limitations of podcasting as methods. And one of the most important has been brought up recently by critical media scholars. And this is beginning to shift, but often if you think about, especially originally, a lot of the podcasts had very similar, were presented by people, were hosted by people with very similar sounding voices, kind of that classic podcast sound. And I think we often associate it with some of the really popular podcasts that first came out, like This American Life and Ira Glass. And the critical media scholars pointed out that oftentimes this is an unmarked voice, but it actually belongs to a particular type of person. And in this context, it was really a white voice, right? So thinking about how racial difference can be obscured and written over even in this environment. And so there's been a real encouragement to move towards including more diverse voices so that we have a broader range of stories represented in our podcasts. And the auditory format allows that to happen in a really different way than text does. The second potential limitation is the need to, especially for feminist scholars, there's a real concern with having a sustained engagement with the research community. And the challenge here is that because podcasts are often created through one episode at a time, where you have people generally kind of come into one episode, they don't necessarily come into all of the episodes. And so it can be a very quick engagement. And what we need is a sustained engagement with the research community over time, at least in many contexts, not in all contexts. And so thinking about the opportunity for podcasts to allow us to engage our community over a long period of time, this is a challenge and a limitation, but that could be potentially overcome as well in podcasting. And then the last is that as a research method, we're not taught the technical skills or given the equipment or to produce or distribute podcasts. And so that can be a challenge that we face when attempting to use podcasting to generate knowledge about a particular topic. All right, great. So how am I doing here? I want to shift focus to get to the topic of the seminar series, which is thinking about climate change and thinking particularly about women's experience and response to climate change. So recently I have been working on a new collaborative project that is looking and thinking about agriculture in the United States, and particularly about moves to regenerative agriculture, or agriculture that's really focused on carbon sequestration in the soil, healthy soils, regenerative ecosystems. And these are a couple of podcasts done by women that engage these concepts. This first one, the Herd podcast, is really focused on ranching and regenerative ranching efforts. And then this other, the Female Farmer Project, is actually more broadly about kind of the really rapid growth of women farmers in the US. It's the most rapidly growing farmer demographic in the country. And this episode or this podcast series tries to document that experience. And so I want to share a couple of clips from these podcasts that we can, that I want to highlight a few things from them. And then perhaps during the discussion, we can chat about what we hear in them. So I'm going to share, first of all, 2 clips. They're each about 2 minutes long from the latest episode of the Female Farmer Project. And this was hosted by Melanie Edwards, which we'll see in a moment, and it was a conversation with Karen Washington. And this is a quote in text from the clip that we're going to listen to. And here, what we see when we write it is, here was a 7-year-old Black girl, little girl, telling her mom that she wanted to be a farmer, and the mother embraced it as something proud, because for so many years we've been misled, and by going away from the land, we have lost our power. So this is the quote in written form. And now I would like to spend a moment listening to this clip. It's about 2 minutes long. I may have forgotten to optimize my audio. Katie, will you just let me know if it sounds okay? All right, here we go.
I think it's happening. Believe it or not, I think it's happening because I see so many young people who are my age, young teenagers who now want to farm. I have a perfect example. A couple of years ago, I was at an event and I was, on a panel just talking about food in general. And as I was leaving, this woman she had to be 7 years old, came up to me and said, Ms. Washington, I know you're busy. Can you stop to take a picture with me and my daughter? And I said, of course. And I always get emotional with this because she said, you know what my daughter said? She said, Mommy, when I grow up, I want to be a farmer. The tears just started streaming because here was a 7-year-old Black girl, little girl, telling her mom that she wanted to be a farmer, and the mother embraced it as something proud. And I just said to myself, to the ancestors, that we have made a way that we have young people, Black and brown, that look at farming as a vocation, that are proud because for so many years we have been misled. And as a result, by going away from the land, away from our history, we've lost our power. But now people understand why we were brought here. We were brought here because of our knowledge of agriculture. And now you see so many young people want to farm. They want to go back to the land because they know how powerful that is, going back to the land and growing your own food.
Great. So my hope is that that clip kind of showed the ways that auditory data that it can add data that doesn't come through in the text. We hear the accent, the vernacular of Karen Washington. We kind of get some pieces of her background, her experience, but we also get, with the way that she uses her intonation, we get exactly what it was about this experience that was significant to her. We can understand really clearly which pieces really meant something, which pieces really resonated with her own backstory and her own experience and her knowledge of her people. And some of that kind of, that meaning that we don't realize how much we get of that when we're listening, but doesn't come through when we simply read the text. So now I want to do another short clip from the same episode, but it's actually going to be a little bit earlier in the episode. And this is, it's going to be Melanie Edwards, who's the host, talking with Karen Washington. And my hope is that this kind of portrays how dialogue can happen and how in the podcast format, and reveal data and knowledge that we might not have otherwise encountered. So here's another clip. Just have to get back to the right spot. Okay, here we go.
More in person in the coming years. And as we, kind of share a little bit about who you are, I just want to know, I want to get started by asking you, how was your childhood experience with agriculture and growing food? And how has that informed your work today as a farmer and an activist?
Yeah, so my relationship to farming was really around the narrative of slavery. I mean, growing up as a child, if you spoke the word that you wanted to be a farmer, then people would laugh at you because farming meant slave work. We never really had a history around agriculture in school. In my 12 years in school, from kindergarten to 12th grade, the only mention of our participation in agriculture was picking cotton. That was it. My relationship to food was the fact that my mom was a good cook. We had 3 meals a day. I never questioned where my food came from. I never questioned who grew it. I never questioned if it was sprayed with pesticides or insecticides. I never questioned the food system, and I just realized how lost I truly was until I really started growing food. And that happened as an adult. That happened in I can remember it vividly. That happened in 1985 when I moved to the Bronx, and I had a big backyard, and I decided that I'll take my hand at growing some food. And so that was my first experience into thinking about agriculture or farming.
It's really interesting, and you touch on a very important part, and it's something that has been a part of my life as well, where you talk about farming within the Black community. It's usually associated with slavery. And that was kind of a perception that was in my household as well. And one of the things when I, first reached out to you and, in your advice for a young Black farmer was, how do we change that perception within the Black farming community? And, I see people like you and many other farmers across the United States that are really actually changing that perception. And I just really hope that we can make that a louder, notion for more people as they learn more about food and where it's coming from.
Great. Okay, so the reason that I wanted to include that clip was because I thought that it was really a good example of the generative kind of work that can happen through dialogue, where Melanie inserted, so Melanie was the host and is also a young Black farmer, a woman Black farmer, and inserted herself into the story, right? And by doing so, was able to create this knowledge that the experience that Karen had, the narrative that she had experienced growing up, wasn't unique to Karen, but was something that was shared in other Black households as well, that both had kind of experienced this narrative, and by inserting herself into this story, that knowledge was generated. And so that's why I wanted to share that clip. Okay, so let's look at some more examples. So I have two more clips that I want to show, and I know for those of you, I'm pretty sure that Katie has probably shared some of these podcasts, but these are a couple of the podcasts that are currently being done by women on climate change: Mothers of Invention, Drilled, and No Place Like Home. These are not researchers. Most of them identify more as investigative journalists. And so it is really interesting. We had, when we were doing our podcasting project, we had a really interesting conversation with an investigative journalist podcaster about kind of the difference between what it would mean to do research versus doing investigative journalism in this context. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to see how they're using podcasts, and I think can be applied in some extents to doing research as well. So I have a couple of more examples that I want to share about how podcasting is being used to document and to improve knowledge of women's experiences of climate change. So the first clip is 2 minutes long, and this clip is from a podcast that is not made by, it's not produced, it's not one of the women in climate change podcasts that I just shared with you. And you'll hear that the host for this podcast actually has that more kind of unmarked white male voice that we kind of associate with classic podcasting. But what's being shared is a quote by Michelle Ehrenberg from the organization Lift Louisiana about the experience of women who were displaced during Hurricane Katrina. And the reason that I wanted to share this story was because it is so evident how hearing a story in this particular case from women can shed light onto how, based on these different social positions, we experience the impacts of climate change differently. And every experience is important, and we need to find out each of those. So here's this episode, this clip. It's gonna take me just a moment to find it. Yes, I think I'm in the right spot. Okay. It's very loud.
Hey, Adapters, we are back, and I am with
Michelle Ehrenberg. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Lift Louisiana, which is a reproductive rights organization that educates, advocates, and litigates for reproductive rights in the state of Louisiana.
Okay, this is a challenge, and I was watching your presentation, but making the link with reproductive rights and dealing with climate change and adapting to climate change, could you explain that?
Yeah, where we're seeing areas of the country in which women have little access to reproductive healthcare services are also the places that are most vulnerable to climate change. And so we're thinking about trying to do something about the increasing rates of maternal mortality, for example, that we're experiencing all over the United States, but particularly severely in the South. We cannot address those issues. We cannot address maternal mortality without thinking about how we are going to factor in climate change, how we're going to factor in what the impact of these communities is going to be when we have to move communities or when women need to evacuate. If they don't have access to reproductive health care services where they need to go because of the impacts of climate change, that is going to have detrimental impacts on their health and the health of their children. So those are some of the connections that we're trying to make. I'll give you a perfect example. I actually evacuated during Hurricane Katrina, and I went to Texas. And because we restrict how women can access birth control, when I realized I wasn't coming back to New Orleans after just 3 days, I was actually going to be gone for 3 months. I had to go to a clinic because I needed a refill of my birth control. We can't just walk into a clinic and get a refill of birth control. It's highly regulated. So you have to see a doctor, you have to do this. And if they don't have appointments available for 2 weeks, because we don't have that many reproductive health providers in the state, then that is a big problem for women. So women are going to go without the healthcare services that they need in these kinds of events. So that's just one example.
Great. So I wanted to share that one to kind of, again, you can sort of see the power of listening to a person tell their own story in this context, and hopefully kind of showing what bringing in multiple different perspectives to a podcast might be able to do. And this is the last clip that I want to share with you, so it will be really quickly. This is one of the Women and Climate Change podcasts that I shared, Mother of Invention. This episode was called Lungs of the North, and they were investigating the impacts of climate change in the Arctic and subarctic regions as told through the voices of Indigenous women. And so they interview 2 Indigenous women in fairly different positions, and I'm only sharing a quote from one, and this was Ariel Techquie Deranger, who's part of the Indigenous Climate Network and was really talking more about the subarctic. And I wanted to conclude my talk with this because, again, I think that the emotions come through, and the use of emotions and intonation come through really well in this particular clip. So I'll share that, and we'll be concluding. Let's see here. Oops.
I used to be rather nasty.
Hold on. That's the beginning of the podcast. We don't need that. Okay, let me see if this is the right spot.
My name is Ariel Techquie Deranger, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. I'm a Dene Sotlene, or Dene woman, and our communities are located primarily in the most northern parts of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, parts of British Columbia, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. So we're Arctic and sort of subarctic cultures and people. Canada's boreal forest is such an amazing and beautiful ecosystem. As Dene people, the word Dene, when you break it down into its 2 root words, de and ne, de means to flow, and ne means from the land. And so we as people flow from the land, and our namesake connects us with those spaces. I was fortunate enough to have grown up with parents that taught me the value of not just the ecosystems, but our relationship with those ecosystems. The rocks, the rivers, the grass, the trees, the plants, the medicines, the birds, the fish, the moose, the caribou, the bison, the deer, the rabbits, and so on and so forth. They are all of our relatives. And we are no more and we are no less, and we are just a part of those systems. I grew up, living in a tent for sometimes 2 months at a time in the year with my parents on the land, hauling water, collecting and trapping and hunting our foods every day, and really thinking about how you live with nature. The sounds, the smells, the feels of the natural world is a very visceral, deep, intimate relationship. It's very pure and it's very full of love and light. And I remember these places, these streams and these river systems and the forests and the sounds of the bugs and the amphibians and the birds and even just the sounds of the trees. My parents separated when I was about 12 years old, and I didn't go up to my territory for almost a decade. And when I went back, I drove over towards where the major operations are, and it is nothing but a desolate landscape. So my memories as a child in that region or lush forests and all this beautiful biodiversity. And then I come over this hill after not being there for 10 years, in which the oil sands expansion had really, really ramped up. When I say it's desolate, I mean it is desolate. It's nothing but gray sand, all fenced in because it's so toxic. And then just beyond that, you see big trucks and shovel operations and nothing but black sand and tar sands everywhere. And
Okay. All right, so that was the last clip, and I wanted to include it because when you think about the process of doing research, to instead of doing an interview with someone, transcribing it, and then writing about it, to be in a process where you're listening to that over and over and over again, you're editing it, you're introing it. And in this case, they were adding background auditory to help kind of think about what adding auditory about what the words she was saying. What kind of meaning is generated through that auditory data? And what are the potentials of engaging that in that way where you're listening over and over and over again, right? Okay, so to wrap up, I think I'm good. Yeah, perfect timing. So to wrap up, these are the conclusions that I came to, and I would be interested in hearing. Again, clearly there are some limitations to this, but your perspectives on the potential of podcasts to be used as a research method. What might we learn from them? This is what I've come up with. So podcasts are important mediums of communication for reaching broader audiences. We know that for certain. But they can also potentially be methods for generating knowledge in different ways. In particular, they allow us to access emotional and embodied data in different ways than working with text on a paper. They also provide opportunity for polyvocal dialogue between the researcher and the research participant, and inserting the researcher into the story, into the research, to be part of the generation of knowledge more clearly. Thirdly, there seems to be, this is more questions that my colleagues and I were left with after we experimented with this, seems to be perhaps a generative connection, a visceral connection that happens through the listening to the data that can create different learning between the researcher, the participants, and the listeners. And the listeners can perhaps take a more active role in interpreting that data as well. Oh, I think that was my next one here. The listeners can take an active role in interpreting the data and bring in a wider range of perspectives to data interpretation. And then, as I was just mentioning, processing audio data requires other forms of engagement where you are listening to the auditory like over and over, and you are putting them together and thinking about, there's still a process of interpretation that happens, but it's you're encountering different data than when you're just looking at the text. And I want to leave us with a quote from a book on creative feminist research methodologies by Patricia Levy that says, by connecting people on emotional and visceral levels, artistic forms of representation facilitate empathy, which is a necessary precondition for challenging harmful stereotypes and building coalitions and community across difference. So to conclude, I would like to thank Nari Sennaik and Eden Kincaid, who collaborated with me on this project. I also thank the Penn State Coalition of Graduate Employees and all of our interviewees who contributed so much to our efforts in this regard. And of course, thanks to Katie and to the McGillicuddy Humanities Center and the WGS Department at University of Maine for organizing the series and inviting me to be a part of it. And I have quite a list of references that I would be happy to share outside of this time for anyone who's interested. All right.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kelsey.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, I'm just getting set up here to transition to the Q&A part. If folks in the audience have questions, feel free to go ahead and drop them into the chat. I'll mention a couple things. The first is the link to where these videos and the Women in Climate Change series get archived, and that's with the McGillicuddy Humanities Center's YouTube channel. So if Dr. Emard, if you do have slides to share, we can link them in the comments there. If anyone wants to go back and see prior talks in the series, that's the best place to go.
Perfect. Well, Katie, I just have my slides on my computer, but I could send them. I don't know what's the easiest way. I'm happy to make them available to people. So.
Sure. Well, we'll have the recording, which kind of captures all of your slides and the progression of like how you wanted to narrate them too. If you've got that resource slide, that might be a good one to link and share.
Perfect.
And we can get that set up. But yeah, thanks so much for your talk. I just love that you had this focus, or like you touched on food systems, which for those that don't know, this talk series it goes along with a class that I'm teaching in WGS, Women and Climate Change. And that seems to be one of our recurring themes that we keep coming back to is food systems, food sovereignty. Organizing around food and fellowship is really one of the themes that people seem to find some hope with thinking about climate change and some of the power structures that have led us to this point. And I also think you had great examples for the podcasts too, just reinforcing that point of how there's emotion. There's all these things that are lost when you look at a transcript and just see like ... those ellipses. Yeah. Oftentimes those were the most emotive parts of it. And just other subtle things like I noticed the background audio went from like birds to the sound of like trucks backing up in that last podcast as she talked about the tar sands. Yeah. So we've had a few questions come in. Let's see. Kat Haber has asked, so first she expresses thanks, but then also asked, who is a woman you would like to hear start her own podcast?
Oh my goodness, what a fascinating question. Yeah, that's great. I would love to hear other people's comments on that. This is one that I feel like I don't have anyone that I've been thinking about that. So now I need to think about it. What would be wonderful? That's a great question. I feel like if other people have ideas, I'd be curious to hear their thoughts. I mean, for me, the power of telling the podcast is that really there is so much opportunity for a diversity of people from all backgrounds to join in. And if we can make the equipment and the distribution methods more available, we can get some really amazing perspectives and stories. So I want to hear those stories that have been least encountered, told in this context. So I don't have any person off the top of my mind, but there would be many wonderful stories to be told. Thank you for that question. It's a good one for me to think about.
Sure. Well, I can ask, as you or others think about that, also in the class, we've got students who are making video or podcast for the first time as part of their semester projects. Great. So I think I'd ask, do you have any advice that you would share with students, like maybe a couple takeaways or things you'd wish you'd known about making podcasts that you would like to share?
Well, from the experience of making it, I will tell you, you're probably farther along than we were. The three of us were very inexperienced technologically. And so I would say that the power of it was that not having those technical skills required us to really grapple with what making a podcast does bring to the table. And it really did force us to think really hard about how we're weaving together auditory data and what we hear when we listen to these moments over and over again, and how do we bring together. So in our episodes, I don't know what you're doing, but we brought together multiple different interviews into one episode. So we had a lot of voices and stories happening. And oftentimes with the three of us hosting together, there was conflict between the three of us about what an interview with someone had meant and what content exactly, what argument we wanted to make in the podcast. And so there was a real iterative process to this research. It was something that as we were trying to get through the technical, as we were trying to piece things together and add our own voices in, there were a lot of difficult questions that we had to ask that we didn't see coming until we were in the process of putting it together. So I guess that's my takeaway, is that there really is something in the process of putting together a podcast that makes you grapple with the content of the data in a really deep way. And that was a takeaway for me. And the technical elements get easier, I guess, as you keep working on them.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the technical side. I will say I accepted podcast projects for the first time last spring when I taught this class. And this was a course we had taught in person for half the semester and then had lockdown. For me personally, it was great to hear students' voices again. I really liked that medium. But I would ask students this year to please compress your files so I don't have to download half a gigabyte podcasts.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
Yeah, so we've got more questions and our attendee size is around 30 today, which becomes, it's a bit more comfortable if folks want to unmute and engage a bit more and ask their questions. Nola, who is in the class, I put her on the spot a little bit and asked if she would like to ask her question herself, and anybody else, feel free to engage a bit more than just the chat at this point.
Sure, well, I'll ask mine, which I'll reiterate. So I know for my project, I'll be making a video format. And I was really curious if at all in your research, you found if there were any benefits or limitations that sort of crossed over from the podcast format into a video format. I know particularly I consume a lot more videos via YouTube or other social media platforms, more so than podcasts. And I know I personally prefer them, but I'm curious if you've seen if one is more effective than the other, or if one, reaches a different kind of audience or anything like that.
Great, thank you, Nola. Thank you for asking, and I appreciate that question a lot. So we didn't work in the video format, but I think a lot of the potential, when I think about what working with a podcast can do for generating for generating data, and the embodied and emotional aspects of data that we can get at when we do podcasting, I think similarly, there's even more that comes with video, because now you have face expressions, you have body language, and you can get that a little bit through the auditory, but you can get that even more through video. And so I think there's even more embodied and emotional data to work with in the video format, even than there is in podcasting. So I think the potentials are really exciting there. The podcasting, I think, I think it's more of a distributional element that podcasting is something that people often listen to on the go, whereas videoing will generally require a bit more engagement on the listener's part in terms of being present and being able to sit down and watch and listen to that medium. So I just think that not that either one is better than the other, but just that they're different and they require different kinds of engagement from the audience, from the person who's engaging with the research, from the audience. And then, as I said, I think that the video even takes it farther in terms of the amount of embodied data that you can access. Yeah, I hope that gets at some of your question. Great.
Yeah, so next up, Katherine Willis. She's got a question, so we'll pass to Dr. Willis.
Yes, thanks so much, Kelsey. This is a great talk. I really appreciate it. And I had a question about accessibility with a capital A, and how you, account for accessibility in people with audio disabilities that can't hear a podcast. How would you suggest or think about conveying that sort of interesting audio information that's in a podcast that we can't just read about or see or experience in other formats?
That's a really wonderful question. Thank you so much, Katherine, for bringing that up. I really appreciate that. It's obviously we can transcribe the podcast, but again, then we're losing some of the data that we're saying can be conveyed auditorily that can't be written. And so I think this is a really important thing to think about and consider. And to some way there is limitation. And again, I think a lot of times if we do switch over to using podcasts, I think providing transcripts of those is like a basic what needs to happen as just a like standard for all podcasts as a starting point, as like a foundation. But beyond that, it does get to, can we explore other ways of conveying that auditory data without being auditory? Like, what would it mean to use other sources, images, or what other method is there of conveying some of that smell or sound, like what, or it's not sound, smell, or touch, like what other methods might we have in a longer term way? And those obviously we can't move through the internet, but perhaps there's ways that we can use like museums to try to convey, or like sorry, I'm blanking. Wow, like installations to try to convey some of that data in other more tangible ways, perhaps. So I think there's some interesting directions we could go, but I think as a basic foundation, of course, those would need to be transcribed, and we could try to capture some of the background sounds into text.
I'm going to add to your comment very briefly.
Thank you.
This is just from an oral historian perspective, that there's a program that's very popular among oral historians called Oral History Metadata Schema. And it takes transcriptions. One, it makes it searchable. So it turns the words into data. So you can see, exactly when certain topics came up. So for longer interviews that, if someone also has attention difficulties, sitting through an hour-and-a-half interview to get to like the 5 or 10 minute bit that's particularly pertinent to them. It allows people to jump through kind of time and space of an interview based on the metadata from the transcriptions, but it also syncs it so you can listen to it and watch it scroll at the time, and lets you kind of hop around. And so this is kind of something in the early stages that oral historians and museum professionals are using. But a lot of time it's just like it's not adaptable, or it doesn't work with certain collections management systems and archival systems, and everything's kind of so proprietary right now, but there are people kind of looking into how can we make exactly the same material available to a variety of different learners. So there are things in the works, and there's an oral history podcasting program called Zencaster, which is kind of like Zoom without video. That also has some abilities to do some things with this. But yeah, it's a good problem to be considering though. So thank you for whoever brought up that question.
Yeah, I'll express thanks too. And Kate, if you haven't seen, Mo Whiteman expressed in the chat, she appreciates your question too, because I was thinking about podcasts as being a more accessible format for people with reading imperatives and didn't think about the hearing aspect. Yeah, absolutely. And I know for my part, incorporating podcasts in the classroom has been new to me. There's this explosion, especially of women creating climate change podcasts. And as I've sort of gotten very excited about that, I do appreciate the colleagues and others who have kind of checked me on that and pointed out that there are certain people who will not find these as accessible as the rest of us, for sure. And Kelsey, I don't know if you can speak to, are there different norms around transcription for podcasts versus maybe academic transcription? I know from my own experience with transcription, it can be a little bit reductionist. You make those decisions about gestures or, cough, sneezes, even just like the sounds that we make get reduced to like just one standard make sound or something like that. So are there different norms for transcripts or for podcasts that might try to capture?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, that's a great question. I do not know. I don't know what the so I can't answer that with a real practical answer. But I do think it is really interesting, and it's one of the things when we're even as researchers say, we do an interview and we get it transcribed, oftentimes we'll end up going back to the audio to listen because we realize that something has been reducted through the process and that we need to get the more context. But in a podcast, if you're reading a transcription, you don't necessarily have that opportunity always. So I think that thinking that through would be really important. If we're using it in a class, we perhaps have more say on how it gets transcribed. But if we're just getting a transcription that the podcaster provides, then that's, I think, a really important concern. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that that was a good conversation. And Karen, I appreciated what you added. That was really interesting about the transcription of oral histories.
Well, and just talking to you earlier, I see such an alignment with podcasts and oral histories and with just the way that we tell stories and pass information along and value certain voices and kind of build off of each other and find our place. You know, research is me search. And so I think podcasts are the perfect opportunity to kind of take something that right now you might be calling it a podcast, but as a historian, someone 50 years from now listening to that same interview, it's going to be valuable for completely different, reasons.
Yeah, you're right.
I think, having a historical record of those voices is quite important. So from a historian's perspective, I love what you're doing. So thank you.
Thanks. That's great.
Any other questions? Because if not, that's a nice note to end on. Thanks for that, Karen. Of course, we'd all like to hear that expression that we love what someone else is doing in their work and scholarship. Yeah, thanks to those who attended today. As I mentioned, we've got one more talk in this series on April 8th. And I've linked in today's chat some resources that either can help you link back to some of these talks and content or some of our upcoming events as well. But thanks so much, Dr. Emard, for being here today.
Well, thank you all. Yeah, I'm going to take off, but I just wanted to say thank you all for coming and for participating and having all these great questions. And it was a joy to see you all here. Thanks for those of you I can see your face and the texts. Take care and have a wonderful afternoon.
All right. Thank you.